At 11:43 in the evening on August 6, 1943, Radioman, second-class Robert Chen, pressed his headphones against his ears and listened to the encrypted message crackling through the static. USS Stack rolled gently in the darkness of Vella Gulf, her engines throttled back to barely 8 knots. Chen's hands moved quickly across his cipher pad, converting the jumbled letters into readable English. Contact confirmed. 4 destroyers. Blackett Strait. 2300 hours. He ripped the message from his pad and handed it to the messenger, who disappeared up the ladder toward the bridge. Commander Aaron Stanton Merrill, Stack's commanding officer, read the message and looked at the luminous dial of his watch. 17 minutes. The Japanese were 17 minutes away, steaming directly toward them through the darkness, completely unaware that 6 American destroyers were waiting in perfect ambush position. For the first time in the Pacific War, American destroyers would fight entirely on their own terms. No cruisers to slow them down, no admirals second-guessing their tactics, no orders to hold back and play it safe. Just destroyers doing what they were built to do, hunt and kill with torpedoes in the darkness. What happened in the next 23 minutes would prove that American destroyers could beat the Japanese at their own game. But nobody on Stack knew that yet. They only knew that for 18 months Japanese destroyers had dominated every night engagement. They only knew that the last time American ships fought in these waters, they'd lost a cruiser and limped home damaged. They only knew that somewhere out there in the blackness, 4 enemy destroyers were approaching, loaded with troops and supplies, confident in their superiority. The question wasn't whether the Americans would fight. The question was whether they would survive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Night naval combat in the summer of 1943 belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy. For nearly 2 years, Japanese destroyer crews had perfected tactics that made darkness their ally. Superior optical equipment, aggressive doctrine built around rapid torpedo attacks, rigorous training in night maneuvers, most importantly, the Type 93 torpedo called the Long Lance by Americans who'd watched it sink their ships. The Long Lance was 24 feet long, weighed over 2 tons, and carried 1,000 pounds of high explosive. It ran at 48 knots for 20 miles, leaving almost no visible wake. American torpedoes ran at 45 knots for 6,000 yards and left white trails of bubbles that could be seen from miles away. The Japanese weapon could hit from 3 times farther at higher speed with 3 times the effective range. Japanese destroyer doctrine maximized this advantage. Approach at high speed under cover of darkness. Launch torpedoes from extreme range before the enemy knew you were there. Turn away and disappear while your torpedoes were still running. By the time the enemy realized they were under attack, it was too late. The torpedoes were already in the water, already tracking toward their targets, already impossible to evade. This doctrine had produced devastating victories throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. At Savo Island, in August 1942, Japanese cruisers surprised an Allied force and sank 4 heavy cruisers in 32 minutes. At Tassafaronga, in November 1942, 8 Japanese destroyers engaged a superior American force of 5 cruisers and 6 destroyers. The Americans had radar. They detected the Japanese first. They opened fire first. They sank 1 Japanese destroyer in the opening salvos. Then the Long Lance torpedoes arrived. Heavy cruiser Northampton took 2 hits and sank. Minneapolis took 1 hit that blew off her bow. New Orleans took 1 hit that blew off her bow. Pensacola took 1 hit that nearly sank her. 4 American cruisers destroyed or crippled in exchange for 1 Japanese destroyer sunk. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, had turned his entire force away from the American fleet, fired torpedoes while retreating, and achieved one of the most lopsided victories in naval history. American commanders struggled to understand what was happening. The intelligence reports didn't make sense. Torpedoes were hitting from ranges that should have been impossible. Ships were being struck by weapons that left no visible wake. The mathematics of the engagement didn't work with what Americans thought they knew about Japanese torpedo capabilities. Rear Admiral Carlton Wright, who commanded the American force at Tassafaronga, wrote in his action report that his ships must have been attacked by submarines. He stated explicitly that the observed positions of the Japanese destroyers made it improbable that torpedoes with speed-distance characteristics similar to American torpedoes could have caused such damage. Wright was correct. Japanese torpedoes weren't similar to American torpedoes. They were vastly superior, but American intelligence didn't know that yet. The existence of the Long Lance was suspected, but not confirmed. Most American naval officers in mid-1943 still believed Japanese torpedoes were roughly equivalent to their own. This misunderstanding cost American lives throughout 1942 and early 1943. American destroyer tactics in the Solomon Islands reflected this misunderstanding and something worse, a fundamental distrust of destroyer capabilities. Throughout the first 18 months of the Pacific War, American destroyers were tied to cruiser formations. Doctrine required destroyers to screen the cruisers, maintain formation discipline, and await orders before attacking. Destroyers were forbidden from conducting independent torpedo attacks. The reasoning seemed sound. Cruisers had heavier guns, better armor, and superior command facilities. They should lead the formations. Destroyers should support them. This was how the Navy had trained between the wars. This was what doctrine required. This was what most admirals believed. The problem was that this doctrine negated the destroyer's primary advantage, speed and torpedoes. American destroyers were fast, maneuverable ships designed to close with the enemy, launch devastating torpedo attacks, and escape before the enemy could respond. They were offensive weapons, but American doctrine used them defensively. At Tassafaronga, destroyer Fletcher detected the Japanese force on radar at 18,000 yards. Fletcher's commanding officer, Commander William Cole, immediately recognized the perfect setup for a torpedo attack. The Japanese were steaming directly toward the American formation in column. Fletcher could approach from the flank, launch torpedoes, and devastate the enemy before the Japanese knew they were under attack. Cole requested permission to attack. Admiral Wright delayed for 4 minutes while he considered the request. By the time Wright granted permission, the tactical situation had changed. The Japanese had detected the American formation. They were already turning away. They were already launching their own torpedoes. Cole's moment had passed. Fletcher fired her torpedoes, but the Japanese were no longer where they had been 4 minutes earlier. The American torpedoes missed. The Japanese torpedoes hit. 4 American cruisers were destroyed or crippled because an admiral 4 minutes earlier couldn't trust a destroyer commander to make the attack decision himself. This pattern repeated throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. At Vella Gulf in July 1943, American cruisers and destroyers intercepted a Japanese force. The American destroyers detected the enemy first on radar. They maneuvered into excellent firing position. They requested permission to attack. The cruiser commander delayed while he confirmed the radar contacts. By the time he granted permission, the opportunity had degraded. The American torpedoes launched late. Most missed. The Japanese torpedoes launched on time. Light cruiser Helena took 3 hits and broke in half. She sank in less than 20 minutes with heavy loss of life. The Americans sank 2 Japanese destroyers, but lost a cruiser in exchange. Another costly draw in waters where the Japanese continued to demonstrate superiority in night combat. At Columbangara in July 1943, the pattern repeated again. American cruisers and destroyers engaged Japanese destroyers escorting a supply convoy. The Americans had radar. They detected the Japanese early. They maneuvered into firing position. They opened fire and sank 1 Japanese destroyer immediately. Then the Long Lance torpedoes arrived again. Light cruiser St. Louis took 1 hit. Light cruiser Honolulu took 1 hit. Light cruiser HMNZS Leander took 1 hit that damaged her so severely she never returned to combat. New Zealand's most powerful warship permanently crippled in a single night action. 3 cruisers damaged in exchange for 1 Japanese destroyer sunk. The Americans claimed victory because they'd prevented the Japanese from landing their supplies. But the tactical exchange favored Japan. American cruisers were being knocked out of the war faster than they could be replaced. The Japanese were losing destroyers they could more easily afford to spare. By August 1943, the pattern was clear and unsustainable. American cruisers couldn't survive these night engagements. Their superior guns couldn't protect them from torpedoes they couldn't see. Their armor couldn't stop 1,000-pound warheads. Their formations couldn't maneuver quickly enough to evade weapons launched from extreme range. The cruiser force in the South Pacific was shattered. Of the cruisers that had fought at Guadalcanal in November 1942, most were sunk or under repair. Replacements were arriving, but they were immediately thrown into the same meat grinder of night combat where Japanese torpedo superiority continued to dominate. Rear Admiral Theodore Wilkinson understood the problem. He'd taken command of Task Force 31 in July 1943 after the disasters at Vella Gulf and Kolombangara. He looked at his available forces and made a radical decision. The next time the Japanese ran the Tokyo Express, the supply convoys that reinforced Japanese garrisons under cover of darkness, Wilkinson would not send cruisers to intercept them. He would send destroyers, just destroyers. 6 of them, operating independently, free to maneuver and attack without waiting for permission from cruiser admirals who didn't understand destroyer tactics. It was a calculated risk based on brutal mathematics. Cruisers were being destroyed in these engagements. Destroyers were surviving. Japanese destroyer commanders respected American destroyers and maneuvered cautiously when they detected them. Japanese destroyer commanders did not respect American cruiser formations and attacked them aggressively. If American destroyers could fight without the handicap of protecting cruisers, perhaps they could finally win a night engagement. Perhaps they could use their torpedoes the way destroyers were meant to use them. Aggressively, decisively, independently. Perhaps they could prove that American destroyers weren't inferior to Japanese destroyers. They'd just been fighting under doctrine that prevented them from using their strengths. Wilkinson needed the right commander. He needed someone who understood destroyer tactics, someone who trusted his crews, someone who wouldn't second-guess himself when the moment came to attack. He found that commander in Frederick Moosbrugger. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger was 43 years old in August 1943. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1922 and spent most of his career on destroyers. He understood destroyer operations intimately. He knew what the ships could do. More importantly, he knew what the crews could do when properly trained and properly led. Moosbrugger had studied every action report from the night battles in the Solomons. He'd read the after-action analyses. He'd examined the tactical diagrams. He understood exactly why American forces kept losing. The problem wasn't the ships. The problem wasn't the crews. The problem was doctrine that prevented destroyers from fighting as destroyers. Moosbrugger had worked under Commodore Arleigh Burke, who was developing new destroyer tactics based on lessons from Tassafaronga and the subsequent defeats. Burke recognized that destroyers needed to attack independently with torpedoes before opening gunfire. Torpedoes were the primary weapon. Guns were secondary. Radar made torpedo attacks possible at ranges where visual spotting was impossible. The doctrine Burke developed was simple: use radar to detect the enemy, maneuver into firing position without being detected, launch torpedoes from optimal range, turn away to evade return fire. Only after the torpedoes hit should destroyers close and engage with guns to finish damaged ships. This was offensive destroyer doctrine. This was how destroyers were meant to fight. When Wilkinson selected Moosbrugger to command Task Group 31.2 on August 5, 1943, he gave Moosbrugger 6 destroyers and extraordinary freedom. Wilkinson's orders were clear but flexible. Intercept the Japanese supply convoy expected on the night of August 6th. Use whatever tactics Moosbrugger thought best. Wilkinson would not dictate doctrine. He would not micromanage the engagement. Moosbrugger could fight his destroyers as he saw fit. That trust was revolutionary. For 18 months, destroyer commanders had operated under rigid tactical control from cruiser admirals. Now, Moosbrugger had complete tactical freedom. He intended to use it. Moosbrugger organized his 6 destroyers into 2 divisions. Division A1 consisted of USS Dunlap, USS Craven, and USS Maury. These 3 ships would lead the attack. They carried full torpedo loadouts, 10 Mark 15 torpedoes per ship in 2 quintuple mounts, 30 torpedoes total, ready to launch in coordinated salvos. Division A2 consisted of USS Lang, USS Sterett, and USS Stack. These ships had reduced torpedo loadouts. Some of their torpedo tubes had been removed and replaced with quad 40mm anti-aircraft guns. The modification reflected the Navy's increasing concern about Japanese air attacks, but it reduced their offensive capability in surface combat. Division A2 would support Division A1 with gunfire and secondary torpedo attacks. Moosbrugger briefed his captains on August 5th at Tulagi. The plan was straightforward. Intelligence indicated the Japanese would run another Tokyo Express convoy on the night of August 6th, 4 destroyers carrying troops and supplies to reinforce the garrison at Vella on Kolombangara Island. The Japanese had used the same route for 3 previous supply runs, north around Vella Island, through Vella Gulf between Vella and Kolombangara, then into Blackett Strait, where they would offload supplies onto barges. The Japanese operational plan was predictable because it had worked. American PT boats had tried to intercept the August 1st convoy. 15 PT boats fired between 26 and 30 torpedoes. All missed. The Japanese destroyers successfully unloaded their cargo, and on the return trip, Sank PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant John Kennedy, later President of the United States. The Japanese had every reason to believe the route was safe. American cruisers had been bloodied badly in previous engagements and were avoiding Vella Gulf. American PT boats had proven ineffective. American destroyers had never operated independently in these waters. The Japanese expected no serious opposition. Moosbrugger intended to exploit that confidence. His destroyers would enter Vella Gulf from the south and position themselves along the Japanese route. They would maintain strict radio silence. They would run at slow speed to minimize wake and noise. They would wait in darkness with radar sweeping continuously. When the Japanese appeared, Division A1 would maneuver into ideal firing position and launch torpedoes, only torpedoes. No gunfire until after the torpedoes hit. This was critical. Gunfire would reveal the American positions. Muzzle flashes would destroy the Americans' night vision. Smoke and flame would illuminate the ships. The Japanese would immediately know where to shoot and where to aim their own torpedoes. But if the Americans fired only torpedoes, they would remain invisible. The Japanese would have no warning until the torpedoes hit. Moosbrugger emphasized this point repeatedly during the briefing. Do not fire guns until the torpedoes detonate. Do not illuminate with searchlights. Do not break radio silence. Remain invisible. Let the torpedoes do the killing. Only after the Japanese ships are burning should Division A2 close and finish them with gunfire. The captains understood. They'd studied the same action reports Moosbrugger had studied. They knew American forces had lost every night engagement where they'd given away their positions early. They knew Japanese long-lance torpedoes could hit from ranges where American guns were ineffective. The only way to win was to shoot first from darkness and hit before the Japanese knew where to aim. Commander Aaron Merrill, commanding USS Stack, asked about rescue operations. If the Japanese ship sank, there would be hundreds of men in the water. Navy doctrine required attempting rescue of survivors when tactically feasible. Moosbrugger's answer was blunt. After the action, if time permitted and if Japanese reinforcements weren't approaching, they would attempt rescue. But the primary mission was destruction of the convoy. Humanitarian concerns were secondary. This reflected the brutal reality of war in the Solomons in August 1943. The Japanese garrisons had to be isolated. Every supply convoy that got through extended Japanese resistance. Every soldier landed on Kolombangara meant more American casualties in future operations. The destroyers would sink the ships. The troops and sailors aboard would die. That was the mission. On the afternoon of August the 6th, Task Group 31.2 departed Tulagi and headed northwest. The 6 destroyers steamed in column formation at 15 knots. The sea was calm. Visibility was poor. Low clouds blocked starlight. The air was hot and humid, typical of the Solomons in August. The smell of jungle vegetation drifted from Guadalcanal as they passed to the north. At 2200 hours, the formation entered Vella Gulf from the south. Moosbrugger ordered speed reduced to 8 knots. The destroyers spread into their assigned positions. Division A1 formed a column, with Dunlap leading, followed by Craven, then Maury. They positioned themselves on the western side of the Gulf. Division A2 formed a parallel column, 4,000 yards to the east, with Lang leading, followed by Starrett, then Stack. The formation created a trap 12,000 yards wide. Any Japanese ships entering from the north would pass between the two American divisions. The Americans would detect them on radar long before the Japanese knew American ships were present. Both divisions could attack simultaneously from different angles, overwhelming the enemy's ability to respond. The SG surface search radar on each destroyer swept continuously. The radar operators watched their screens intently, looking for contacts against the dark coastline of Columbangara. The radar returns from the land were strong and stable. Any ships moving in the Gulf would appear as contacts separating from the landmass. At 2300 hours, Admiral Wilkinson radioed a final intelligence update. 4 Japanese destroyers confirmed en route. Expected arrival, Blackett Strait entrance, approximately 23:30. Moosbrugger acknowledged. 30 minutes. His destroyers continued their slow patrol, waiting. Aboard Stack, the crew had been at general quarters since 2100 hours. Every man was at his battle station. The gun crews stood ready behind their 5-inch mounts. The torpedo crews stood ready at the quintuple launchers. The damage control parties waited below decks with hoses and pumps and shoring equipment. The engineering crews tended the boilers and turbines that would provide emergency power when the order came to increase speed. Radioman Chen sat at his station, monitoring frequencies. He heard nothing but static. The Japanese maintained strict radio silence. During Tokyo Express runs, they wouldn't transmit until after they'd completed their mission and were heading home. But American radio intelligence had already intercepted and decoded the Japanese operational plan days earlier. The Americans knew exactly where the Japanese would be. The Japanese had no idea American destroyers were waiting. At 23:22, the SG radar operator on Dunlap detected contacts emerging from behind the northern tip of Columbangara, range 22,000 yards, 4 distinct contacts in column formation, moving south at approximately 20 knots. The operator reported to his captain, who reported to Moosbrugger over TBS radio. The tactical talk between ships, radio circuit. Contacts bearing 340, range 22,000 yards, 4 ships in column, speed 20 knots. Moosbrugger acknowledged. He watched the radar plot on his own screen. The Japanese were exactly where intelligence said they would be, exactly when they were supposed to be there. They were steaming directly into the trap. Moosbrugger ordered Division A1 to increase speed to 25 knots and maneuver into firing position. He ordered Division A2 to maintain position and prepare to support with gunfire after Division A1 launched torpedoes. The mathematics of the intercept were straightforward. The Japanese were approaching at 20 knots. Division A1 was closing at 25 knots, combined closing speed 45 knots, range decreasing at approximately 1,500 yards per minute. The Japanese would be at optimal torpedo range between 8,000 and 10,000 yards in approximately 8 minutes. Moosbrugger maneuvered Division A1 to the west, positioning his column to cross ahead of the Japanese formation. This would allow all 3 destroyers to fire full broadsides, 10 torpedoes per ship at the approaching enemy. 30 torpedoes launched in rapid succession would create an overlapping pattern impossible to evade. Even if individual torpedoes missed, the sheer density of weapons in the water guaranteed multiple hits. The Japanese continued south, unaware. They had no radar to detect the approaching Americans. Their lookouts strained to see through darkness. But at 22,000 yards, in poor visibility, visual detection was impossible. The Japanese commander, Captain Kaju Sugiura, aboard destroyer Shigure, believed his greatest threat was American PT boats. He'd dealt with PT boats before. They were fast and aggressive, but inaccurate. Their torpedoes rarely hit. Sugiura's formation consisted of 4 destroyers. Shigure led, carrying no troops. She was the escort. Behind her came Hagikaze, Arashi, and Kawakaze, each loaded with 300 soldiers and supplies. The three cargo ships rode low in the water, their decks crowded with troops and equipment. They were vulnerable, but Sugiura believed the route was safe. 3 previous convoys had used the same route without incident. At 23:38, range had decreased to 10,000 yards. Moosbrugger had maneuvered Division A1 into perfect position. His 3 destroyers were crossing ahead of the Japanese formation at 90 degrees. Every torpedo tube on all 3 ships pointed directly at the approaching enemy column. Moosbrugger gave the order. Division A1, prepare to fire torpedoes, fire on my command. The torpedo crews made final adjustments. The Mark 15 torpedoes were set to run at depths of 10 feet. The gyroscope angles were set to spread the torpedoes across the projected enemy course. The fire control solutions were calculated based on radar data. Enemy bearing, enemy range, enemy speed, own ship speed, torpedo speed. The Mark 1 computer, a mechanical calculator built into the torpedo fire control station, processed all variables and provided firing solutions. At 23:42, with range at 8,000 yards, Moosbrugger ordered, fire. 30 torpedoes launched in 63 seconds. The quintuple mounts rotated outboard and released their weapons with compressed air. The torpedoes hit the water nose first, accelerated to 45 knots, and began their runs toward the Japanese formation. Each weapon weighed 3,500 pounds and carried 825 pounds of TNT in the warhead. The torpedoes ran true, their gyroscopes holding them on course, their depth mechanisms keeping them just below the surface. The American destroyers turned away immediately after firing, executing a coordinated turn to port that pointed them back toward the southern entrance of Vella Gulf. This maneuver served 2 purposes. First, it minimized the American profile and made them harder targets if the Japanese fired back. Second, it positioned the Americans to escape quickly if the engagement went wrong. For 90 seconds, nothing happened. The torpedoes ran through black water toward targets that didn't know they were under attack. The Japanese lookouts saw nothing. The Japanese commanders suspected nothing. Captain Sugiura stood on Shigure's bridge and watched the darkness ahead, thinking about the supplies he would deliver and the return trip through waters he believed were safe. Then, at 23, 43, and 40 seconds, the first torpedo hit. The explosion was massive, 825 pounds of TNT detonating against Hagakaze's hull at the waterline. The blast punched through steel plating and penetrated into the engine room. Superheated steam erupted from ruptured boilers. The compartment flooded instantly. Everyone inside died within seconds. More torpedoes hit. Arashi took 2 hits almost simultaneously, one forward and one amidships. Both explosions were catastrophic. The forward hit destroyed her bow structure. The amidships hit broke her keel. The destroyer's back broke. She began settling immediately, her structure collapsing under its own weight. Kawakaze took the worst hit. A torpedo struck her magazine. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic. The entire forward third of the ship disintegrated in a fireball visible from 10 miles away. Flames shot 300 feet into the air. The blast wave knocked down men on surrounding ships. Kawakaze rolled over and sank within 2 minutes. Shigure, unburdened by troops and cargo, was hit by a dud torpedo that damaged her rudder but failed to detonate. Captain Sugiura immediately ordered emergency speed and began evasive maneuvers. He fired 8 torpedoes blindly toward where he thought the Americans might be. All 8 missed. Shigure turned north and fled at maximum speed, leaving her consorts burning and sinking behind her. Division A2 now closed from the east. Lang, Sterret, and Stack opened fire with their 5-inch guns at ranges under 8,000 yards. The American shells fell among the burning Japanese destroyers. Hagikaze and Arashi, already mortally wounded by torpedo hits, were hit repeatedly by gunfire. Within minutes, both ships capsized and sank. The entire action lasted 23 minutes, from first torpedo launch to last gunshot. 3 Japanese destroyers sunk, 900 soldiers killed, over 500 sailors killed. Total Japanese losses, approximately 1,400 men. American losses, 0. Not one American ship was hit, not one American sailor was wounded. It was the most one-sided victory in destroyer combat in the Pacific War to that point. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The American destroyers circled the debris field for 2 hours, attempting to rescue survivors. They found hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors floating in the water, clinging to wreckage, wearing life jackets. The Americans threw lines. They lowered boats. They offered rescue to enemy personnel, following naval tradition and international law requiring assistance to survivors when tactically feasible. The Japanese refused. Almost universally, they refused. They pushed away the lines. They swam away from the rescue boats. Many began singing the hymn to the dead, a Japanese naval tradition for sailors who knew they were dying. The sound carried across the dark water, hundreds of voices, singing in unison, choosing death over capture. Some Japanese soldiers and sailors committed suicide rather than accept rescue. They removed their life jackets and allowed themselves to sink. Others drew knives and slashed their own throats or wrists. The Americans watched, horrified and helpless, as hundreds of men deliberately drowned themselves rather than become prisoners. After 2 hours, with only a handful of survivors actually rescued and with the possibility of Japanese reinforcements approaching, Moosbrugger ordered Task Group 31.2 to withdraw. The 6 destroyers headed south down the slot toward Tulagi. They arrived at dawn on August 7th, without incident. Of the approximately 1,400 Japanese soldiers and sailors in the water after the battle, only about 300 survived. They swam to shore on Vella or Kolombangara and were later evacuated by the Japanese. The Battle of Vella Gulf changed everything. It was the first American victory in a destroyer versus destroyer night torpedo action in the Pacific War. For 18 months, Japanese destroyers had dominated night combat. Now, in a single engagement lasting 23 minutes, American destroyers had achieved complete victory using the tactics they'd been prevented from using throughout 1942 and early 1943. The lesson was unmistakable. American destroyers could fight and win at night when properly employed. They could use radar to detect and track enemies in complete darkness. They could launch devastating torpedo attacks from ranges where the Japanese couldn't detect them. They could fight independently without cruiser support and achieve results that cruiser-destroyer formations had failed to achieve in 6 previous engagements. Admiral Wilkinson immediately recognized the significance. He sent a message to Admiral Halsey. Destroyers, operating independently, achieved complete victory with no losses. Request authority to employ similar tactics in future engagements. Halsey approved. From August 1943 forward, American destroyers in the South Pacific would fight as independent strike forces, not as cruiser escorts. The tactical doctrine pioneered at Vella Gulf became standard throughout the Pacific Fleet. Use radar to detect the enemy, maneuver silently into optimal firing position, launch torpedoes before opening gunfire, turn away to evade counterattack, close only after the enemy is burning to finish with guns. This doctrine produced victory after victory. At Cape St. George in November 1943, American destroyers using identical tactics sank 3 more Japanese destroyers with no American losses. At Surigao Strait in October 1944, American destroyers using these tactics helped annihilate a Japanese battleship force. The psychological impact on the Japanese was devastating. For 20 months, Japanese destroyer commanders had operated with confidence built on superior training, superior torpedoes, and superior night combat doctrine. Now they were being destroyed by enemies they couldn't see, firing from positions they couldn't detect, using technology they didn't possess. That confidence evaporated. Japanese commanders who had been aggressive became cautious. Units that had pressed attacks began withdrawing when radar-equipped American destroyers appeared. The Tokyo Express continued operating, but Japanese planners avoided routes where American destroyers might intercept. The strategic initiative shifted permanently. Within a week of Vella Gulf, the Japanese abandoned efforts to hold Kolombangara. They evacuated their garrison, 12,000 troops, because they could no longer supply them. The Americans bypassed the island and landed on Vella to the west, cutting off Japanese forces throughout the Central Solomons. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger received the Navy Cross for his tactical leadership. His captains received individual commendations. The crews received the knowledge that they had proven American destroyers were equal to any in the world when properly led and properly employed. But the real heroes were the men like Radioman Robert Chen and the thousands of sailors who'd trained hard, trusted their equipment, and executed their missions flawlessly under pressure. They had changed naval warfare in the Pacific. They had ended Japanese dominance of night combat. They had shown that radar and torpedoes in the hands of well-trained crews could overcome superior numbers and superior experience. The 6 destroyers that fought at Vella Gulf continued serving throughout the war. USS Stack participated in dozens of operations through 1945. She survived the war and was decommissioned in 1946. The lesson they taught that night in August 1943 remained relevant for decades. Technology properly integrated with tactics and training could revolutionize warfare. But technology alone wasn't enough. Leadership that trusted its people, doctrine that used weapons properly, and training that prepared crews for the realities of combat. These factors together produced victory. Vella Gulf proved that American sailors were as skilled and as brave as any in the world. They just needed the chance to prove it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.